Good evening. Gonna wait a couple of seconds before get some people if they're attending. We got probably about 77 degrees today, partly cloudy skies here in New York. It was actually really nice. I went outside before, and very comfortable weather. About time, but we have some uncomfortable uh, things to hash out here tonight. So it's going to concentrate on the response from the Bush White House regarding civil liberties and, of course, the Geneva Conventions of enemy combatants or those deemed enemy combatants, and how the Bush White House Counsel, subverted the Department of Justice and rewrote a memorandum which basically gave the Bush presidency uh, unlimited, unchecked power when it comes to overriding the Geneva Convention. And so I think what I'd like to start off with is, even in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, just in the hours afterwards, um, it was later revealed that uh, there was this shadow government that was being formed. And I don't want to say it happened overnight. I think this has actually happened or in the plans when Bush became president. And it initially deployed after the events of September 11th, 2001. In other words, what they needed was an event to happen to take full advantage and to subvert U.S. civil liberties. And initially, this government was deployed executive directives on government continuity in the face of a crisis, which are dating back to the Reagan administration, that are put into effect. Now, it's estimated that approximately 100 mid-level officers are moved to underground bunkers and they stay there. And this is the continuity of government that I once wrote about. During the Reagan administration, Dick Cheney and Richard Clark, who was part of these continuity of government exercises, would be taken in the middle of the night from their houses by the Secret Service and put into these underground bunkers. And the exercises were to mimic that if the Soviets launched a nuclear war on the United States, that there would be separate areas still functioning. These would be areas of government. So if Dick Cheney was in one area, Richard Clark's in another, or Don Rumsfeld's in another, at least there's this called continuity of government. So if one cell is destroyed, you have other cells operating uh, separately from one another, but acting in accordance with one another. And so basically, these officials would rotate in and out on a 90-day scale. And when its existence was later revealed, much later, some controversy would arise that because the shadow government included no Democrats, in fact, top congressional Democrats would be unaware of this operation until journalists like the Washington Post and CBS News, when they wrote about it in March 1st of 2002, if you want to look it up, March 1st, 2002, Washington Post and CBS, March 2nd, 2002, that they broke the story. When they broke the story, they saw that there was this neoconservative faction within the country that were acting in accordance with one another about this formation of this government that would exist. 7 days later, or a week after 9/11, the Justice Department published an interim regulation which allowed non-citizens suspected of terrorism or suspected of conspiring in terrorism to be detained without charge for 48 hours, or, as they call it, quote, an additional reasonable period of time, end quote. And the new rule is used to hold hundreds indefinitely in these secret prisons, in Guantanamo prison as well, until the Patriot Act passes in October, which was providing more solid grounds to hold non citizens without charge. Now, just to go back a little bit, uh, in the days after 9/11, White House lawyers like Alberto Gonzales, John Yoo, would draft a proposal that would give the Bush White House virtually unchecked authority and to do virtually anything. Now, I mentioned the name Alberto Gonzales, who's the White House lead counsel. He demanded to Congress that they expand the president's authority even further than what was already agreed upon, because Bush wanted to wage war against suspected terrorists abroad, but more importantly, inside the United States in the future. But Congress, led by its split on Democrats and Republicans, they came to a compromise. And what they would give the president is the authority to treat the war on terror as an armed conflict with very few boundaries. So that means Bush could use all necessary and appropriate force to wage war against any nation harboring terrorists, or whether they were persons or organizations determined by Bush that they were conspiring in terrorism or part of or affiliated with the September 11th attacks. Just a mere suspicion could put you under the assault by the Bush White House. And on September 14th, the Senate voted unanimously 420 to 1 to expand on more unlimited war powers for a president, which is unprecedented. And a secret White House memo from the Justice Department argued that in times of national emergency, if the president decided the threat justified deploying the military inside the country, he would be given authority to do so. So that means that the government could legally raid or attack dwellings with terrorists or those who are suspected of terrorism, who were thought to be aiding and abetting terrorists. Now, this is, of course, despite the risks that third parties could also be injured by exchanges of gunfire. The government could also shoot down civilian airliners that were hijacked by terrorists and set up military operations inside American cities. Now, the two men who became quite influential in drafting these remarkable pieces of legislation were John Yoo, the Deputy Chief of the Justice Department, and Timothy Flanagan, who is the lawyer for the White House Counsel Office. And what made them really stand out was both of them are active in the Federalist Society, which is a group of conservative lawyers who want to reestablish the original interpretation of the Constitution. So these guys basically really catered to the neoconservative faction of the Bush White House. And we're talking about Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, even the more harsh war hawks, the dual Israeli citizens like Richard Perle, Douglas Feith, Paul Wolfowitz, Scooter Libby. So Dick Cheney's lawyer, personal lawyer, David Addington, as well as John Yoo, what they wanted to do was to authorize the fight against terrorism from a criminal justice matter, meaning a Department of Justice matter, to a full-fledged military war, well, where more power would be subjected to the Bush White House, thereby allowing the CIA and the Pentagon to capture or kill, and if they want to capture them, they could question terror suspects as swiftly as possible with as much latitude as possible. And this is huge because this actually gives the White House unprecedented power in terms of this war on terror. And by the way, the war on terror hasn't ended even now. Yes, we're out of Afghanistan, but the war on terrorism is legally a war of an ideology. This is the ingenious of this. The ingenious of labeling a war against an ideology. Usually wars are deemed against a certain enemy, faction, or a country. Now, we didn't fight the Germans in World War II when it came to a war on nationalism, right? Because that would be ridiculous. A war on terrorism, meaning that anyone's a terrorist, because the meaning is vague. What determines a terrorist? Well, according to the Patriot Act, anybody who conspires to do unlawful acts for a political or an apolitical reason against the state. That's pretty vague. That could mean you could be a terrorist in the future. Now, John Yoo would argue that no one could limit the method, the timing, or the place regarding the president's war on terror. So right there, just this is lawyers who are telling you this, that they could limit the method. No one could. Nobody could. Nobody could. I'll say it again. Nobody could limit the timing, the method, or the place regarding the president's war on terror. That's amazing. That means that anytime, anywhere, if the White House deems you a terrorist, that means you are not afforded the same civil liberties as an American citizen. This is for foreign nationals, which later on extend to Americans. Now, yes, we're afforded the Geneva Convention, but to any foreigner who's in this country or outside of it, you could face indefinite detention. Now, on October 25th, Vice President Cheney called for a meeting with the members of the House and Senate Intelligence Oversight Committee as he outlined a closely guarded plan for Bush. This is the plan. It was the terrorist surveillance program, which allowed the NSA to intercept phone calls and other communications, including emails, to and from the United States without a warrant. Now, according to Dick Cheney, and I'm going to read you a quote that he did on Meet the Press on September 16, 2001. And this just goes to show you that what the federal government was planning to do in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, that is, they weren't going to fight on a honest manner or judicial manner, that they were going to basically do illegal things. Now, I'll read you the quote. This is from Meet the Press. Quote, "We also have to work through sort of a dark side, if you will. If we got to spend time in the shadows in the intelligence world, a lot of what needs to be done here will have to be done quietly, without any discussion, using sources and methods that are available to our intelligence agencies, if we're going to be successful. That's the world these folks operate in. And so it's going to be vital for us to use any means at our disposal, basically, to achieve our objective," end quote. And what is he saying there? Now, of course, he's mentioning that they need to act and to familiarize themselves, just as a terrorist would, to defeat the terrorists. So, in other words, they're going to break laws. They're going to break down the walls that are there for a reason. That they're going to act without any hesitation, without any pause from any disagreements from any committee, congressional or lawful Department of Justice, any oversight committee. Nothing can stop them. Now, of course, there's a huge vehement disagreement between the White House Counsel and lawyers in the NSA about how to bypass U.S. laws regarding the privacy of citizens' data. Remember, now there's two fronts here that are happening in the days after 9/11. One is regarding data privacy that they want to bypass U.S. laws for this. Two, how to treat foreign nationals who are suspected of terrorism and to bypass the Geneva Convention. This is important because this has a ripple effect to the current day. Now, the White House later engaged with NSA Director Michael Hayden about the need for the NSA to collect as much metadata as possible without the use of walls. And miraculously, he was given a green light. Actually, what Bush did was invite Hayden, who he barely knew, by the way. And what he did was he basically told him, what do you need to be successful? And Hayden said, you need the walls to be broken through. We need to act and to override certain laws that are protecting the Americans' privacy. This is huge because now the NSA can collect data without a warrant, and it's from the American citizenry. And this was all in secret, by the way. The American public had no idea. I'm going to get to this in a minute about when it became public. But on September 20th of 2001, the Project for the New American Century, which is a very influential neoconservative think tank, they would end up publishing a letter addressed to President Bush insisting that the war on terrorism include as one of the objectives to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Now this is a quote from the PNAC document to the letter to Bush. Quote, even if evidence does not link Iraq directly to the attack. End quote. That's a direct quote. Now in 1997, in 1998, PNAC actually wrote a letter to President Clinton and basically said that they need to push for the U.S. to involve themselves in the Iraq, to overthrow the Iraq government. And Clinton basically ignored two letters from them. And what happened to Clinton? Well, you have the Monica Lewinsky scandal. That's what undermined him. Now, the Project for New American Century also says that the U.S. should demand that Iran and Syria cease all support for Hezbollah. And if they fail to do so, the United States should retaliate against those two countries as well. Now, of course, who's leading the charge in this? This is obvious. This is Israel, right? I mean, most of the co-signers of the Project for New American Century would go on to have high levels of position in the Bush government, as well as being dual U.S.-Israeli citizens. And even in the letter, it stated that Israel is praised as America's staunchest ally against international terrorism. That's in the letter that PNAC sent to Bush on September 20th. Okay, I don't think I need to tell you any further about where this influence is coming from. Right, it's coming from Israel and the United States. Now, Douglas Feith, who was a co-signer of the PNAC document, and also one of the primary and very limited members of the Office of Special Plans, suggests in a draft memo that the United States should consider hitting terrorists outside the Middle East in their initial offensive, perhaps deliberately selecting a non-Al Qaeda target like Iraq. And other regions he proposes attacking include South America and Southeast Asia. some of these people are just basically bloodthirsts or bloodlusts. They don't care if a million people end up dying. That's how many people died in the Iraq War. It's approximately, anyway. We'll never know the exact number. Now, Fight reasons that an initial attack against such targets would surprise the terrorists and catch them off guard. This was shot down because basically, if we uh, went and engaged in a war in a country outside the Middle East, such as South America, I mean, we're facing consequences for this, just like we did with Iraq, but that came later. Now, the Bush White House have forced the hand of the intelligence community to find Al Qaeda and an Iraq connection. And so Bush met with the director, Robert Mueller of the FBI, and he couldn't find it. So the CIA had taken up the tasks. Now, this caused a split in the agency because many in the CIA knew that there was no connection. But Tenet, Director George Tenet, had a wild card. And I'm going to read a quote from Flint Levernet, who's a senior staff member of the Bush National Security Council. Quote, there were constant efforts to pressure the intelligence community to provide assessments that would support their views. If they couldn't get what they wanted out of the intelligence community, they simply created their own intelligence. End quote. That was the Office of Special Plans. That's Douglas Feith, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl. Even Secretary of State Colin Powell, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. They weren't allowed in this room. This is the White House we're talking about, okay? Not everybody, I know there's this belief that there's the whole government is in on it, or everyone's on the same page, and they're not. Some people are much more evil, much more worse off than others. Okay. Now, Vice President Cheney, he wanted to reformat laws regarding prisoners of war. And so something big happened on November 13, 2001. This is really big. John Yoo had sanctioned White House plans to give the Defense Department sole authority to decide which terrorists will be tried in military commissions, thereby superseding the Department of Justice. And Attorney General John Ashcroft was horrified when he heard that this is basically Cheney right here. This ain't Bush, because Bush is on vacation here, right? According to Cheney. So Cheney basically is abdicating the Department of Justice because they're the ones who are in charge of arresting people who are terrorists or associates of terrorists or suspected of terrorism, and that they would be tried in American courts. No, what the White House Counsel wanted to do was give the Defense Department sole authority to decide who would be terrorists and who would be tried in military commissions. Now, Secretary of State Colin Powell, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, and Attorney General John Ashcroft, they're all left out of the loop. No idea what was going on. And when they found out what was going on, it was much too late. Now, David Addington would later edit the draft to where the White House and not the Defense Department would decide which terrorists were tried or who would be labeled terrorists. This is huge because the memo also ignored international law, suggesting that the president could abide by it or not, and terrorists would not be afforded protection of the Geneva Convention. Unbelievable. This would mean that any foreign nation that the president deems as a nation that allows terrorists living inside it or have conspired in terrorism will come under attack by the United States government. And even more important, regarding this memo, that defendants would have limited rights to confront their accusers. They would also not be able to see evidence against them while indefinite detention. These rules for the military commission would be dictated on an ad hoc basis by the Secretary of Defense at the time, Donald Rumsfeld. And of course, the backlash for this was uh, forthright, but there was nothing to be done. And Stephen Cheney, who's an Australian lawyer, remarked that the United States will never charge anyone because there's no incentive to. They could just hold and interrogate every single detainee forever. That sounds familiar? That's what we're doing with Abu Zubaydah. Allegedly, when he was captured, he was considered the third most powerful Al Qaeda member. And then in 2000, and I think 6 or 7, the CIA basically, after torturing him for 4 or 5 years, basically said, "Oh, sorry, you're not really a high-ranking Al Qaeda member." However, he's the only Guantanamo detainee prisoner who is held without charge because of this memo. People don't realize how big this is, how important this is, because sooner or later, when there's no more Al Qaeda terrorists to detain, you're next because the wording is vague. December 19, 2001, Pakistan security forces and the ISI captured an individual who was escaping Afghanistan. His name was Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, and he was turned over to the CIA. He was actually chief of the Chaldean training camp in Afghanistan. And Jack Clooney, who worked out of the FBI counterterrorism office, along with Russell Fincher, all interviewed al-Libi. And they got impertinent information from him, including one plot, which was the bombing of a U.S. embassy in Aden, Yemen. And the information from al-Libi was shared with the CIA, and then the CIA basically took over. Much like with every FBI prisoner, the CIA actually took over the Libby case. And they did this with Abu Zubaydah. They did this with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. They did this with all the prisoners, al-Qaeda prisoners. But the decision came from Bush, who favored George Tenet over Mueller, as Bush preferred the CIA tough guy approach. He didn't want to be seen as soft. He also approved the rendition program, which actually started under the Clinton administration. But after 9/11, the staff at CIA counterterrorism had grown from 300 to 1,200 in weeks who participated in this program. Now, it's not known exactly how many people have been renditioned by the CIA because the program remains classified. And so the United States chose Egypt as a country to send prisoners using the program because they can enforce torture methods that the United States cannot legally. And Egypt was notoriously known for using torture methods which are illegal inside the United States. This is led by the State Security Investigation Services, or the SSI. And this goes back even to the Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt, way back to the 50s and 60s, 50 years ago. And how this program worked was that each subject under the rendition program, which is authorized either by George Tenet or the head of the Counterterrorism Center, Cofer Black. Now, when I said this was the rendition program started under Clinton, in 1988, it was Clinton who signed a classified memo called Apprehension, Extradition, Rendition, and Prosecution regarding wanted fugitives. But the program expedited after 9/11, and after 9/11, CIA black sites were seen, black sites meaning that these are secret prisons where torture is legal. Cuba, Afghanistan, Poland, Germany, Iraq, Egypt, and soon over a dozen countries were involved in the program. On January 18th of 2002, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, he sends an order to the Joint Chiefs of Staff declaring that the military no longer needed to follow the Geneva Convention in handling of people suspected of being part of the Taliban or Al Qaeda. This is just the first step to the memo. The president has decided that all prisoners captured are enemy combatants. Here's the term enemy combatant. What's an enemy combatant? Is it people from the Taliban or Al Qaeda? It doesn't say that. These words are vague for a reason. The White House Counsel did this for a reason. Now, going back to al-Libi. He's in Egypt. He's getting tortured. They're trying to find out whether Al Qaeda and Iraq are procuring chemical weapons. And he actually gives them whatever they wanted. And according to what he told his CIA handlers were, and this is a quote from Sheikh ibn al-Libi, quote, Iraq, acting on the request of al-Qaeda militant Abu Abdallah, who is Mohammed Atef's emissary, the military commander, agreed to provide unspecified chemical or biological weapons training for 2 al-Qaeda associates beginning in December of 2000. The 2 individuals departed for Iraq but did not return. End quote. But al-Libi was in no position to know if any trading had taken place. And we don't know if this story came out to be true. Because I think the CIA made this whole thing up. And they did later on. It came out that they made everything up. However, did this stop from the United States government to use it? Well, his forced confessions, which will later turn out to be false, were used by the Secretary of State Colin Powell to the United Nations Security Council to go to war against Iraq. And it was George Tenet, director of the CIA, who vouched for Libby to Powell, even though Powell was skeptical. A year later, when the wars commenced in Iraq, officials go to al-Libi and say, why did you make the story up? And he basically told them they were killing me. I had to tell them something. But that didn't stop the Bush neocon warhawks such as Richard Pearl, Douglas Feith, Robert Kagan, Paul Wolfowitz, the co-signers of the PNAC document. They ultimately got what they wanted after 20 years, which was a full-scale invasion of Iraq. And on May 19, 2009, Egyptian authorities found al-Libi hanged in a cell. His death was ruled a suicide. Of course. And just like, Epstein just killed himself. Now, of course, suspicions arose that he was killed on orders from the CIA as they feared, international organizations that were going to visit him and get him to speak on his torture from his captors, and basically he would spill the beans. So what does this mean? Are we ever going to see real justice? Are we going to see any type of, any type of judicial inquiry regarding the Bush White House? Well, it took a foreign country to do so, because on May 12, 2002, the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Commission found that John Yoo, President Bush, Vice President Cheney, and several other senior members of the Bush administration guilty of war crimes in absentia. It figures it would be Malaysia. The trial heard harrowing witness accounts from victims of torture who suffered at the hands of U.S. soldiers and contractors from the CIA in Iraq and Afghanistan. And also involved being guilty of war crimes in absentia were Alberto Gonzales, David Addington, William Haynes, Jay Bybee, and John Yoo, because they created the legislation for torture. That's what they did. Now, as for the data privacy or the programs run by the Bush White House regarding the NSA to collect metadata of every single American. Now, in 2000 2006, Mark Klein, who was a AT&T technician, goes to the SBC Communications building at 611 Folsom Street in San Francisco, in which a couple of floors were occupied by AT&T. But he found a room that he's never seen before. And the room was called 641A. Room is actually 24 by 48 feet, and it contains several racks of equipment, including a Norris STA 6400, which is actually a device designed to intercept and analyze internet communications at very high speeds. It's led by a fiber optic line from beam splitters, which are installed in fiber optic trunks carrying internet backbone traffic. And Mark Klein actually blew the whistle, and he was actually the subject of a 2006 class action lawsuit by the Electronic Frontier Foundation against AT&T. The Electronic Frontier Foundation is an international nonprofit digital rights group based in California. Now, later on, Klein would also state that he was told that similar black rooms are operating at other facilities around the United States. On January 31st, 2006, Mark Klein and the Electronic Frontier Foundation filed a class action lawsuit against AT&T, accusing the telecommunications company of violating the law and the privacy of its customers by collaborating with the NSA, which was involved in a massive illegal program to wiretap and data mine American communications. But this isn't the worst of it. Because in 2007, the case was heard by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the case was dismissed based on a retroactive grant of immunity by Congress. And the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case. This goes to show you that the power of the federal government has regarding even the Supreme Court. In June of 2013, there were reports from a cache of top secret documents leaked by Edward Snowden, an NSA contractor. And he revealed that the NSA and its international partners had created a global system of surveillance that was responsible for the mass collection of information on Americans and foreign citizens. This is led by the Five Eyes community. The Five Eyes community being Canada, Australia, United States, Great Britain, I think New Zealand, which is now more countries are involved, but at the time it was five. But these are all signals intelligence agencies that are basically involved with the data mining of the citizens of each country. Now, what happens is that all these agencies now share information about their own citizens with each and every country. So that means no matter anywhere in the world where you go, your privacy is not respected. It's actually collected. Obama, who's the president at this point, he feigns ignorance and defends the mass surveillance program when they first came out to the press. And he argued that the NSA surveillance was transparent and claimed that the NSA was unable and had to make no attempt to monitor phone calls or emails of citizens. Now, later on, when NSA Director Keith Alexander was asked by Senator Hank Johnson, if the NSA is listening to phone calls, he said no. Were they collecting emails? He said no. Were they reading text messages and collecting text messages? He said no. All that was a lie. Committed. He lied in front of a sitting congressman, because what they were doing was they were collecting every single phone call, every single email, and every single text message, and they were storing it in a facility called the Utah Data Center, which is basically located in Pine Bluff, Utah. It's a tremendous facility which stores every single American's email and text message, and also monitoring of your phone calls. And this was huge because President Obama, in January 17th, 2014, he would give a public address on mass surveillance. And during the speech, Obama promised increased restrictions on data collection of American citizens. And then Obama then called for increased oversight and admitted that the NSA was in violation of, excuse me, civil liberties. But his speech was criticized for being vague and not going so far. In fact, it was the opposite. And of course, Rand Paul criticized Obama, saying that while he was encouraged that the president is addressing the NSA spying program because of pressure from Congress and the American people, I am disappointed in the details. And Paul also went on to say that the Fourth Amendment required an individualized warrant based on probable cause before the government can search phone calls and emails. And President Obama's announced solution to the NSA spying controversy is the same unconstitutional program with a new configuration. Rand Paul went on to say also, I intend to continue the fight to restore Americans' rights through the Fourth Amendment Restoration Act and my legal challenge against the NSA. And in March of 2014, Obama promised to end the NSA's collection and storage of bulk phone call data. However, like with most things Obama, the administration continued to seek reauthorization of the telephone metadata program. Unbelievable. Well, a couple of years later, on May 24, 2017, in a now declassified FISA report, which is marked top secret, was published, which I could probably, if I could find it, yeah, I'll provide that in the description, because it was noting that the NSA routinely violated the Fourth Amendment rights of Americans under the Obama administration and abused intelligence tools to do so. In fact, the Obama administration self-disclosed the problems at a closed-door hearing on October 26th before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court 2 weeks before the election. Now, of course, National Security Advisor under Obama, Susan Rice, she argued that the activities were legal under the so-called minimization rule changes the Obama administration made. Of course, right? That they were monitoring civil abuses, that they weren't going overboard, that they weren't breaking any, they weren't violating any privacy laws. Even though the FISA court agreed that there was abuse of civil liberties regarding American citizens in this program. And the FISA report also indicated that hundreds of incidences in which the FBI illegally shared raw surveillance data illegally obtained by the NSA through private entities. So the FBI was in on it. And FBI Director James Comey, he went out to tell lawmakers that the agency used sensitive espionage data gathered about Americans without a warrant only when it was lawfully collected, overseen, and checked. Yeah, right. And finally, on April 28, 2017, the NSA issued a very rare press release indicating that it would no longer monitor all internet communications, which is bullshit. They still do, right? I don't believe anything these people say anyway. And all of what I told you now past history, current history, about what's happening here in the United States from the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, the Bush White House, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, even to the current Biden administration. Okay. Guantanamo is still open. We still haven't had a trial. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi bin al-Shib, Wali bin Attash, Ahmed al-Hasnawi, Ammar al-Baluchi, the 5 who are involved with the September 11th terrorist attacks allegedly, still haven't had a trial, still haven't faced their accusers. And there's a reason why, because they were tortured by the CIA, but they didn't have to. Why were they tortured? Because so that you wouldn't know the truth. You're believed whether you're left to your beliefs. If you believe they're guilty, if you believe they're not guilty, it's an indecision, which leaves you in a state of paralysis. It's exactly where the federal government wants you to be. They don't want you to make a decision. Decisions based on action. Decisions based on information. That's why we're in a war for information and a war against disinformation. And so, because it's so complex and it's so broad, the American people just give up, left to their own devices, left to believe whatever they want. And so these laws, these memorandums, these decrees that were fashioned under the Bush White House, by the White House Legal Counsel, by the NSA, by the CIA, are all going to come back to haunt us, because the next terrorists aren't Arabs. They're going to be you, the American people. Why do you think they went to these great lengths to create this legislation, these memorandums? To abuse the civil liberties of who? Arabs or us? Well, it's us. We're the final enemy. And they could go to war against countries, but we're long past the day of land invasions. This is a technological war, a nuclear war. So nobody wants to go to nuclear war because that would end all life, and because people in positions of power would like to hand down their power to their own generations. That means the war has to continue. By the way, the war, like I said, the war on terrorism hasn't ended, because we're the final enemy, the American people. And make no mistake, all these conflicts that we're having, all these isms, racism, religion, politics, sexism, are all meant to distract us and keep us divided from each other, in the hopes that we become so fragmented and so segregated that the federal government can easily defeat us. This is no longer a government for the people, by the people, and hasn't been for decades, centuries. And that will be all for the live discussion tonight. Thank you for coming, and thank you for watching. And I'll see you in the next video.